If you're new in town or just new to this whole podcast thing, you're tuning in to Lore by Night, the podcast that discusses all things vampiric with no fear of breaching the masquerade. In this episode, we shall review Second Inquisition, a sourcebook for Vampire the Masquerade 5th Edition. I shall present my thoughts and opinions on its presentation and mechanics to help you better decide whether this is the sourcebook for you. The last time we looked at an official Vampire the Masquerade 5th Edition book, we had to wade through the V5 Sabbat book, which I can be summed up as spicy. I make the distinction here, for the other V5 themed book was the homebrew The Black Hand, playing the Sabbat, which is somehow worse and more offensive than the material in which it was based on, even with its many updates, which almost makes it feel like a video game released way too soon. Now, whether you liked those books or not, I believe it is fair to say that both homebrew and official V5 Sabbat supplements placed mechanics, stats and powers before lore, world building and metaplot, a trifecta of game design that makes World of Darkness games stand out from their competition, elements both these books are sparsely lacking and heavily contradicting, undoing and poorly restarting 30 years of established lore and material. I was and still am nervous for what the future brings for new V5 sourcebooks. It was something I commented on in the aforementioned Sabbat book reviews. I spoke about the Second Inquisition preview in my V5 Sabbat book review, highlighting it seemed to follow a similar shallow gamey vibe to directly quote myself. I had already pre-ordered the book and I came seriously close to cancelling it on more than one occasion. Similar to the Sabbat book, pre-ordering the physical book from Renegade Game Studios' website granted me the PDF upon release. I read it, made some notes and talked a little bit about it on Twitter. After what felt like a lifetime of waiting, I got my physical copy on the 7th of May 2022 and reminded myself of what I read and made some additional notes. Having done this and rearranged my script writing schedule to get this review to you, the beautiful listeners, as soon as possible, I think it is about high time we get stuck into this book and see whether the Sabbat book was another glitch in the Matrix or a more gamified Vampire the Masquerade is here to stay. But before we dive into the book review proper, here are the rules for the Lore by Night book reviews. I will explore snippets of the lore, mechanics and rules found within the tome. I will look as to how they are presented and easily they're conveyed to new and old players alike. As this is a review written and presented by me, all thoughts and opinions are my own, so if you disagree with something I've said, that is totally fine. It does not mean that you are right and I'm wrong and vice versa. A good place to start with anything is at the beginning, which has to start with the physical book itself, which currently sits neatly upon my lap. It is a letter-sized hardback book with a female-presenting hunter in a black jacket and blacked-out eyes with a rifle of some description. I am sure the gun nerds amongst you will be able to tell me what it is and how it is missing a scope, like some of you did on Twitter, but I honestly don't give a shit. This individual is standing against a sketchy cityscape with bright, vibrant shades that imply that it is on fire, almost like the vampire safe ivory towers are crumbling down from the ground up, toppling the foundations of their established empire. Whilst it is not my favourite piece by Mark Kelly, there is no denying it is a visually striking piece that highlights the overt yet secretive nature of the SI and the influence they wield in the world of darkness, that they are ultimately able to pull more strings in the background than any kindred, and that is quite a terrifying thought for any vampire, as the fact that they, the SI, are just as monstrous as their undead rivals. One man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter, as they say. Of course, this is my own interpretation here, so it might not be the intention here. The back cover, however, is nowhere near as striking. It is a deep dark brown like chocolate or shit, which should have really been a clue for how I would feel after reading the book. If you own the Camarilla, Anarch, Sabbat books and or the V5 core book in a physical format, you'll be very familiar with how this book feels and looks. The one thing that sets it apart from the Camarilla and Anarch books is that the physical copy comes with a ribboned bookmark, which is a nice addition, I suppose. The book uses a combination of illustrations and photography for its artwork inside of the book, the styles newer and older fans might recognise as they scan the fine glossy pages. Many of the photos are provided by Mark Kelly, who manages to encapsulate the modern kindred with eerie perfection once more. I am particularly fond of the pieces done on pages 14, 68 and 146. piece. I am also very fond of the pieces done by Raquel Cornero, whose name I've probably butchered, for which I apologise deeply. I was very excited to see her name in the credits and her art in the preview, as I've seen her art for her own vampire characters on Twitter, and I was blown away by her styles, and I still am. The pieces on pages 16, 48 and 151 by her are just spectacular, dark, gritty and shockingly lifelike. They really modernise and glamorise the original goth roots of Vampire the Masquerade. Whilst it may seem biased of me to say all of this, given that I consider her an acquaintance of mine, you should know that I do not offer compliments willy-nilly. Not all the art here has that high quality that I expect from the World of Darkness. For example, whenever there is a white space in these books not filled with text or a piece of artwork, there just has to be a blood splatter which removes all the creativity in their purpose. You'll notice that many of these blood splatters are copied and pasted PNG files that have been rotated to hide their similarities. Some, however, look incredibly cheap, the ones found in pages 82, 101, 111 and the legal and credits page. These ones are the same splatter but in different sizes and angles. Similar splatters did appear in the Anarch book for V5, but it is not as obvious there. Other lazy examples take on the form of badly edited stock photos, the worst offenders being pages 64, 91 and 155. Working backwards, the picture of the gargoyle, which has no real relevance to the SI, is an actual stock photo and not me being mean. I know this because I nearly used it for my all-gargoyle one-shot, Turned to Stone. On the right of that image where it's been cropped is the Eiffel Tower. The weird noir detective piece on page 91 has some strange shadows going on, as well as the badly edited SI logo on the green folder, and the nun on page 64 is embarrassingly laughable. The two shadowed hunter figures in the background is what makes a decent picture amateurish. The bisexually illuminated nun has a weird GTA 5 loading screen vibe, which is a statement I never thought I would be writing, but hey ho. What is left of the artwork, however, is just uninteresting and generic. It could have been slotted into a Call of Duty game and have the same level of emotional impact, which is comparable to being hit in the face with a damp cloth. This is the part of the review where I would start talking about the introduction of the book, glossing over the story that sets the mood for the book as a whole, but I would like to talk about that story. Well, I don't actually, but it needs to be discussed all the same. It is a short 2-page transcript between four kindred, just before they have their buttholes obliterated by a surprise attack from the SI. It's a short but totally predictable and bland narrative that is made all the more insulting with the inclusion of an oddly worded COVID joke that doesn't really do anything for the story other than a weak attempt to make it, and possibly the author, feel relevant to the modern reader. And I know when I state including COVID in a TTRPG book is tasteless will get one of two reactions. The first, and probably the most likely, is a variant of the ye old "It's the World of Darkness, fucked up shit's supposed to happen, it's based on our world, so it makes sense that COVID exists." Perhaps, but that is a fictionalized world where vampires, werewolves, ghosts, and time-bending mages exist, so it makes even more sense to not include it. What does the World of Darkness narrative and your games gain from COVID existing? If you wish to use an illness as a plot device, surely you could conjure up something more imaginative. Is that not a far more interesting premise? The other reaction is the one that I and an upsettingly small minority of people share, and it's one of incandescent rage. As of the writing of this script, the coronavirus still plagues our lives. COVID rates are much higher than they have ever been before, and the vast majority of people going to game conventions, pubs, bars, clubs and cinemas, behaving as if everything has returned to the state of normality we had in 2019. Masks are optional at best, and mythological weapons of constricting destruction at worst. Many people have not been able to leave their homes much or at all, which is something I don't expect many listeners to understand, because barely any of you could not stay at home for a year. Having compromised immune systems with or without disabilities makes life incredibly difficult at the best of times. My family and I are some of those people. We have been denied a fairly basic right of leaving our home without the fear of contracting a potentially lethal virus that could kill us or those that we love and care for. It has had serious damning effects on my mental and emotional well-being, as it has done for so many people. So when I see the dialogue in this book, "Twitch, are you alright? You look, well,
Weird. Even for you. You didn't bring the bloody COVID in here.
Being used so flippantly in the placement of some cheap joke angers me. Its weak writing does not belong in the world of darkness, or anywhere for that matter. I, for one, don't see something that has killed hundreds of fucking thousands of people particularly funny, especially as it's ongoing. Once you have healed your aggravated willpower damage from my ranting and / all the mention of COVID, you are greeted with the introductory chapter that details the reader with information already presented to them in the core book but worse, and how the authors want you to use the book, similar to how they wanted you to use the Sabbat book. Once more, again on page 7, the reader is told that the Second Inquisition are antagonists, which means they are not meant for players, which already cuts off a huge portion of the audience willing to buy the book. The introductory chapter ends with a double-page spread that is the SI lexicon. Anyone who is reading the book for the first time will need to refer to the various shorthands and pig Latin that make up the SI terminology, for they are referred to a lot without much reference beyond these pages, which makes the books a very confusing read at times. Some of these are quite jokey and a little childish in practice, calling the solo vampire hunter Helsings after Van Helsing, which is a pretty poor code name for a hunter in my honest opinion. Chapter 1 is a fairly large chapter that is filled to the teeth with various different hunters for the ST to use. I find it puzzling to start a book with stats and enemy types with little reference and presentation, particularly that of a World of Darkness book. I recognise that 5th edition is meant for the newer Vampire the Masquerade player and storyteller. The former may need some help when it comes up to presenting NPCs for players, and I always appreciate some characters getting stats, but the vast amount given to the storyteller leaves next to no imagination for the to come up with their own ideas, as most of the hunters within each class has multiple variants. The hunters that make up the coalition, an SI term, are broken down into a few class types, just like you would find in a video game. You have fixers and faces, who are more social hunters, techies and sleuths, who are more mental based NPCs, hitters and operators, who are physical based, warlocks and clerics, no, I'm not joking, are magical, and then there are the Turncoats, who are the likes of ghouls and thinbloods who actively support and help the SI, which I will discuss in just a moment. One of these types of hunters are called cuckoos, which are undercover agents that blend into kindred circles. The title of cuckoo is ableist, as it is used to mock people with mental or psychiatric disabilities, when not used to describe the bird. It could have been avoided with a sensitivity reader, which the book appears to be absent of. Mole would have sufficed, surely. This isn't the only issue. The main problem the various hunters have is that they all are overpowered. Many of these mostly mortal hunters have stats greater than 4 and up to 9, which is bizarre, as players in 5th edition can only go up to a maximum of 5 points of a given stat, and they are usually called power gamers for doing so, which is often discouraged in Vampire the Masquerade. For example, doctors need to have their own stats apparently, and have been given 6 points in mental and 8 points in medicine. Whenever they deal with blood, they can add 2 dice to their rolls, which gives them a massive 16 dice to use. For a vampiric comparison, if you were to roll any dominate power for Mithras at full strength in V5, you would have 10 dice. Then there is the fact that depending on the command they could resist, and having only 4 dice less could still get them out of Mithras' command with luck, which shouldn't be the case when dealing with a vampire as perfectly powerful and ancient as he. The various magic-wielding hunters make up those using faith, psychic powers, and hedge magic, which is a weird way to bring back the old sorcery sourcebook. These hunters are far more broken and problematic in the grand established lore sense. The psychic and clergy-based sorcerers I can understand existing within the coalition. Psychics would be far and few in between, trained or perhaps groomed by science, whilst the latter is obviously those of great faith to some description of their chosen god. It would be unusual to understand and coexist with them for sure, but it is possible. Other mortal-themed books have addressed this in the past. What I find a little more difficult to get my head around is the existence of sorcerers, actual wizards and the like. All the factions within the Second Inquisition would have seen these individuals as enemies, particularly the Society of Leopold, who don't just focus on the destruction of vampires. The arcane effects, as they are so called here, can pretty much override any ward or discipline a vampire can produce, as well as being being able to heal themselves at a much faster rate than and more damage vampirically possible in a given night. I almost get the impression that whoever wrote this portion hasn't played V5. The chapter does produce some ideas I find to be interesting, yet lacking the punch I was hoping for. Page 39 offers a decent overview on how to bestow places of faith or holy ground, points in true faith, but it is made redundant with the fact that said holy ground only adds to a person's true faith, not force the kindred out or outright burn them, as has been the case for many years now. The Turncoats, the Finnbloods and Ghouls that work with the SI, is an interesting premise that could work wonderfully as a plot hook for a PC or important NPC, one that is ultimately ended with the demise of themselves and those around them, but there are a few points about this section that puzzles me. Firstly, there are two types of Finnbloods here. Alchemists who focus on making potions and the like for the SI, who deliberately harm other vampires, has humanity 6, which is much more than the Finnblood that seeks redemption or turn on those that abuse them, which also has Finnblood alchemy, who are called Daywalkers. I can believe this idea more than the former, as the power is placed on the SI, not the vampire. The SI are also capturing and deploying wights and voljt as weapons too, which they are calling brutes, which is a bit of an understatement. I can understand some branches studying wights to see how they behave and learn of their potential properties, or reduce a more civil canite down to that state for the purposes of science, but deploying them as weapons seems a bit counterintuitive, particularly that of a voljt. That said, humans are pretty fucking stupid sometimes, aren't they? The chapter concludes with a how to build your own SI force, which again is meant for storytellers who are either totally inexperienced with next to no experience, or anyone that lacks imagination and wants to be spoon-fed what to do. Some of the information is useful and interesting, mostly how many you would find in different task forces, as well as unique stats, treating your particular force as its own character, which should absolutely be the case here in my opinion. Where this section falls flat is how gamey it quickly feels, relying too much on the information presented previously. Finally reaching the second chapter, and just under the halfway mark of the book, we are told about the various weapons, relics, artifacts, vehicles, and armors of mass destruction, transportation, and protection, in addition to various pieces of tech that really demonstrate the Second Inquisition are not fucking about with their toys. It actually makes you wonder how on earth there are any vampires left with their various scanners, night goggles, helicopters, sunshine bombs, and of course the Volum Sanctatori, or that red gas from Vampire the Masquerade Blood Hunt, which does an obscene amount of damage to players. I won't lie, I am not a fan of a common feature found in Battle Royale video games making their way into Vampire the Masquerade canon, especially when it is gimmicky as this. The game Blood Hunt suggests it is something akin to the keening, given the fact it only affects kindred and screaming can be heard, but the actual origin is, well, unknown. Seriously, the most popular idea is perhaps the most stupid, which is that it's made from the holiest possible matter, such as the grave dust of St. Peter beneath the Vatican, to directly quote the book. I understand that this is meant for big hits like large crowds and taking out princes, primogens and the like, but not only is the red gas a very finite resource and terribly disrespectful to the deceased, but it's a terribly flawed idea. Unless I am being terribly stupid, couldn't one combat it by opening a fucking window? Following this is a chapter about hunting, investigation and interrogation tactics the SI employ when dealing with kindred. It is a weird chapter to me, because a lot of what is presented are things the ST should be making notes of what is happening in game and using the actions of the players to decide what will happen in the next session or the current one, depending on what the players do or don't do. Having it written out can be useful if you are brand new and / or you run out of inspiration, but a lot of what is suggested is followed by a dice roll of some description, which can pad out sessions, planning, and ultimately overcomplicate actions made by the ST. Chapter 4 is the first real chapter dedicated to the lore of the various factions from across the world that makes up the Second Inquisition, which includes Facebook mum groups apparently. I will accept that there are spreaders of secrets through their own nosy snooping on what is happening in the neighbourhood, but I will not accept that Karen is an SI operative, informal or otherwise, at least not as overtly as presented as here. I don't know what line that is supposed to be read in between, but that's just fucking stupid, as is the stats given to a collective of conspiracy groups, which is essentially boils down to Redditors. That said, the "and free time" comment in their equipment did make me smile. The chapter gives brief descriptions of the SI forces that make up the US, the UK, both of which are presented in fuller and more engaging detail in the Cameron and V5 core book, Russia, Brazil, and the Society of Leopold that together make the 5 torches. It also explores SI influence in countries like Japan, Egypt, and Poland, none of which provided anything interesting for me personally, as nothing really stood out to me. Well, there is one that stood out, and that was the Bo'oes of Brazil, who throughout the book have been presented as far more heroic than their real-world counterparts who, to my limited understanding, have a history of corruption and organised crime, and militias linked to the Bo'ope agents have systematically murdered black people, persecuted temples and practitioners of Afro-Brazilian religions. Now, it is not something I can talk much more than this, for I am not an expert, but I am simultaneously disgusted and not surprised that this was included. It would not be a World of Darkness book that doesn't do social-cultural topics outside of Europe and to the US respectfully. With a writing team of 3 and 1 consulting editor, it's no surprise that this blunder happened, and that is me being really, really nice about it. The 5th and final chapter of the book is the storytelling chapter. It makes suggestions on how to alter the mechanics of the super weapons mentioned within, presents many different story hooks, and takes everything that has been presented and how one may use them in your games, but what is actually presented to the reader really? Chapters 1 and 2, which makes up 76 pages, are really just a list of stats and powers. 76 pages out of 164 pages is what essentially overpowered cannon fodder for players to fight or more likely be killed by said hunters. At least the authors are unapologetic with the intention and/or the direction. Lore is toxic gatekeeping, stats and powers are what the current fanbase wants, only nothing in this book is meant for player consumption. If the players try to use any of the tools, weapons, etc. for their own vampire characters, the ST is to actively put in as many obstacles in their path to prevent them from using the cool toys, just exactly how LA by Night didn't do this in the last season of their actual play. I hate this attitude because it implies the vampires are the morally bad ones, which they aren't necessarily. Barely anyone is here, and it creates an unpleasant ST versus players mentality, like something you would hear in a Dungeons and Dragons horror story. Isn't it funny how they, the writers, claim one thing is toxic that isn't, and then actively engage in and enabling far more toxic habits? Is it also hilarious how White Wolf was shut down for its inclusion of an ongoing war conflict and using it as a narrative for Vampire the Masquerade, but now replace it with, hold on, let me just check my notes, an ongoing pandemic glorifying the Bo'oes? World of Darkness HQ has yet to rectify this with the writing/recording of the script, and even offer a formal apology for the offensive material, just the usual
"We have heard you and looking into it"
from certain members of the World of Darkness HQ, rather than the official media page itself, which we all know what that is PR speak for. But I digress. Second Inquisition for Vampire the Masquerade 5th Edition barely offers a glimpse into the machinations of the antagonistic force. Whilst it is somewhat more useful than the previous 5th Edition sourcebook, its oversaturation of stats for NPCs really does bog down what could have been a larger, more insightful book for the Second Inquisition, exploring how they operate, rather than railroad the story to use its mechanics with little flexibility. A large part of this expands into the decision to remove options for player characters to take on the role of SI operatives, which is something I admit is rather baffling. Yes, I know this is intended primarily as a storyteller's book, but so have been the most of the mortal-themed hunter books. The Hunters Hunted 1 and 2, The Inquisition, Project Twilight, The Quick and the Dead, Medium Speakers of the Dead, The Arcanum, World of Darkness Ghost Hunters, and any other mortal-themed book I've missed provides bulks of information and interesting lore for both storytellers and players to use, and each of these books have character creation chapters for players to take their own supernatural hunters with powers, tools, and other goodies that felt balanced and fair. It encouraged all fans to purchase and use those books, rather than siphoning small portions of said fanbase. What makes this especially bizarre is the existence of the V5 Companion, which has rules for making mortal player characters. Granted, it is exactly the same as regular character creation, minus specific vampire things, but the SI could have included those, altered things to encourage more people to purchase and use their book. Then I remembered that alongside this, Hunter the Reckoning is being updated for 5th edition rules, and it all becomes too clear that World of Darkness HQ wants you to play the hunters it deems to be the good guys, not the ones sanctioned by the government and the church. They are the bad ones, cause it is not like a group of armed vigilantes that target specific groups of minorities is any better than a secret organisation doing exactly the same thing. Just putting it out there so there's no fucking doubt whatsoever. There are no good people in the World of Darkness. They are all varying levels of arsehole. Following the V5 Sabbat book, my expectations of this book were pretty low. I didn't expect there to be much lore, and I felt I would be reading something that didn't reflect the World of Darkness again. Much to my surprise, the Second Inquisition managed to stoop even lower. It is ultimately a disappointing sourcebook that failed to deliver what previous mortal-themed sourcebooks for the World of Darkness would offer for the fans. It gatekeeps information and mechanics for the storyteller to goatsy the players when inspiration fails to deliver anything beyond the blatantly obvious, ableist, and socially problematic. This book confirmed my concerns about the change of direction in World of Darkness material, and I should start lowering my standards and expectations on the quality of future material, as it's all too clear to me the World of Darkness HQ stopped caring some time ago. And for those of you who are new to the Lore by Night brand and the reviews I occasionally do, I do not do out of 10 scores because they are subjectively pointless. One person's 10 out of 10 is another's 3 out of 5 stars, which is another's minus 42 out of 100, so I shall rate this book Ground Penetrating Radar out of 10, as that is just as helpful as a proper out of 10 score. To be kept updated, follow the Lore by Night VDM Twitter and Instagram pages to find out when we will upload each episode. You can also find out by subscribing to the YouTube channel and clicking on the little bell, as you'll be immediately notified when the latest episode is live. Until next time, farewell.